stocking up of certain ports to give greater flexibility to the fleet in the Mediterranean, stocking them up with stores and ammunition and POL and so on was going on. And the Prime Minister interjected a remark. He said, "What is this Paul?" Whereupon a number of us piped up and said, "Petrol, oil, and lubricants, sir." And at the last word, his face lit up a bit. Then there was a pause, and he leant across the table, looked the First Sea Lord straight in the face, and said, "Ah, I see, Admiral, a Paul in every port." Once when he was on a visit to Italy, I had the doubtful distinction of falling asleep at his dinner table. He made some pretty obvious remarks, but he was quite gentle in his chiding of me. On another occasion that I can remember very well, he rescued me when I'd been put in my place by the then CIDS Lord Allenbrook, and he gave me a chance to make my points and develop my argument. It happened this way. Having been in the Dardanelles, I read and studied carefully the report of the Dardanelles Commission. And although that was many years ago, there was one incident in it that has always stuck in my mind. In his evidence to the Commission, Admiral Fisher, who was then First Sea Lord at the time, said something to the effect that though he didn't agree with what was proposed, he hadn't said so at the cabinet meeting when the final decisions were taken because he hadn't been asked for his opinion. On several occasions since, I've been placed in a somewhat similar but less important position. And I've spurred myself on, I've summoned up my courage to speak by saying to myself, "Come on now, don't be a Fisher." Not that Fisher was lacking in courage at all, but in those days it was a sign of the relationships between politicians and the military leaders rather than any lack of courage on Fisher's part. But be that as it may, the incident became a feature, so to speak, in my philosophy. And the occasion to which I'm now referring happened in the summer of 1944. When I arrived late, I'm glad to say through no fault of my own, at a conference held by the Prime Minister in Naples, at which the CIDS, then the late Lord Allenbrook, was present. Now, after listening with some dismay to what was being discussed and planned, I eventually summoned up the courage to butt in, only to be put very sharply in my place by the CIDS. But I was rescued by the Prime Minister, who, as I said, gave me a chance to say my piece and listened attentively to all that I had to say. And that was the type of man he was. Going back to 1915, it was, of course, in Winston Churchill's very active and fertile mind that the idea originated of a breakthrough at the Dardanelles to end the deadlock on the Western Front. And though it failed, in my view, through certain misconceptions and weaknesses of command and administration that I needn't weary you with now, although it did fail, it was nonetheless, as Mr. Basildine said just now, a brilliant idea, a very imaginative concept. Winston's mind was never still. He was always looking for new and better ideas, seeking new ways of defeating the enemy, of bringing nearer the end of the war. Some of his ideas were bad, of course, but many helped a very great deal. Some were decisive, like the Mulberry Harbour, for example. In fact, Sir Winston Churchill was not only a man of action, but a man of ideas as well. And in 1952, having under my command your Canadian Brigade, the first Canadian troops to rise in Europe in peacetime, and a splendid contribution they made then and have done since to the strength and morale and effectiveness of the NATO forces in Western Europe. But at that time, about that time, I was summoned to London and bidden to lunch at number 10. I guessed that I was under inspection for the appointment of CIGS, so was a bit nervous, to say the least of it. And luckily for me, the conversation opened with inquiries about my command. And when I said that I was very pleased with the troops, and particularly with the great interest they showed, and particularly again the young national servicemen showed in their exercises, the Prime Minister immediately said, "What, sham fights?" And then proceeded to launch forth into long stories about his time when he was in the Officers' Training Corps at Harrow. Stories of illicit cigarette smoking behind hedges, shooting in the wrong direction at enemies of his own personal making, and so on. And in fact, we didn't get beyond the expedition of the Naval Division to the Low Countries before he had the lead for the House of Commons, and I wasn't subjected to any serious questioning at all, which explains quite clearly why I became CIGS. To me, his mind seemed to embrace everything he had seen or heard or experienced. His memory was infallible, his enthusiasm infectious, his energy unbounded, and his spirit unconquerable. He believed passionately in Great Britain and in the Commonwealth, and also in our alliance with your neighbor here in North America, the United States. And if he were alive today, I feel sure that he would lend his full support to the great efforts our American allies are making to preserve the political independence and the territorial integrity of South Vietnam. Equally, he would not have hesitated for a moment to give them the benefit of his advice, and that advice, I think, would have been good. Of course, allies can be awkward, even maddening at times, but when they are, it is perhaps as well to remind oneself that one is also an ally. And it wasn't always easy in Italy. And once when Sir Winston was there and Field Marshal Alexander was complaining to him about the problems of waging war on an allied basis, the Prime Minister chipped in and said, "Well, you know, General," as he was then, "there's only one thing that's worse than having allies." "What's that?" Alexander said innocently. "Not having allies," replied the Prime Minister. Well, it's worth thinking about, and not only by us. It's some years now since I had the privilege of commanding the British land forces in the Far East. But when I did get first-hand experience of the peoples and problems of Southeast Asia. And I learned to appreciate the great political, economic, and strategic importance of those territories to the rest of the free world. Consequently, for my part, I have no doubt whatever that the general aims and policies of the United States in stemming the extension of the frontiers of communism are just as essential and sound in Southeast Asia as they were in Korea. Also, I had the good fortune last week of a long talk on the situation in those parts with an old wartime New Zealand friend, General Steve Ware, who is now the New Zealand ambassador in Banquet and who covers Saigon as well, and for whose powers of observation and assessment I have a very high regard. And all that he told me of recent experience in those parts, in Vietnam and Southeast Asia generally, confirms the opinion I've just expressed. And as you will know, the New Zealanders, as well as Australia, have sent already small contingents to Vietnam to work with the Americans there. In fact, I would say that the stability and security of Southeast Asia are of very real and urgent importance, not only to them, Australia and New Zealand, but to Britain and the rest of the Commonwealth as well. General Ware also agreed with the view that I hold strongly, that as in other places, for example, Cyprus and Kenya, the problem in South Vietnam is primarily a political one, and a solution cannot be found by military means alone. As in Malaya, I would suggest that an effective central government, broadly based and liberally minded, capable of gaining the confidence of the people as a whole, is an absolute essential. Equally essential is the steady training and development of an efficient, trusted, and locally manned administration and police force. And those, in my opinion, are fundamental to a solution. Now, all this is much easier said than done. Nonetheless, basic, in my view, to a lasting settlement. Now, following this same line of thought, we found in Malaya, in Kenya, and in Cyprus that a few British Red Cross girls working independently on child welfare and home nursing amongst the people in the villages were able to exercise the most remarkable influence and were never molested in any way. Now, no doubt our American friends have similar ideas in mind. But those things, the effort that can be produced by a small group of dedicated people in that way are amazing in what they can do in what we have come to call the battle of winning the hearts and minds of men and women. Now, speaking of Southeast Asia, and those of you who know Field Marshal Monty may be amused to hear of a conversation I had with the late General Tassini, with whom I spent a week in Tonkin and the Red River Delta when he was Governor General, or whatever the French called it, of Indochina, when that territories were under French control. Now, knowing that he and Monty had worked together, not always harmoniously, in Western Union, I asked the lads one evening how they got on. I admit I did it with my tongue in my cheek. And when I asked the question, he looked coldly at me for a moment, and then he said, for 2 years, Monty and me, we were a dagger's draw. Then one day, Monty, he come to me and said, lads, you are right. And after that, it was one long kiss. I told the story to Monty shortly afterwards, and he nearly went through the roof. But to return to Sir Winston, I have said enough, I think, to convince you of my own very deep affection and intense admiration for this remarkable man. On the 10th of June, 1940, speaking in the House of Commons, Mr. Churchill, as he then was, said these words: I expect that the Battle of Britain is about to begin. Upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization. Upon it depends our own British life and the long continuity of our institutions. That battle was won, thanks very largely, I would say almost entirely, to the inspiration and the leadership of Sir Winston Churchill. But though it is taking a different form, the struggle between freedom and tyranny, between the rule of law and the rule of fear, still goes on. Now, last Friday, in the London Times, there was a leading article referring to the German surrender 20 years ago, in which they quoted from a broadcast made by Sir Winston at that time. They prefaced the quotation with the remark, "We can now see, looking back with hindsight, that on this, as on many other occasions, he was extraordinarily prescient." And this is what Sir Winston said at that time. And I would like to read it to you, because I think it has got very definite application as of today. He said, "I wish I could tell you tonight that all our toils and troubles were over. Then indeed I should end my 5 years' service happily. And if you thought you had had enough of me, and that I ought to be put out to grass, I assure you I would take it with the best of grace. But on the contrary, I must warn you, as I did when I began this 5 years' task, and no one knew then that it would last so long, that there is still a lot to do, and that you must be prepared for further efforts of mind and body, and further sacrifices to great causes, if you are not to fall back into the rut of inertia, the confusion of aim, and the craven fear of being great. You must not weaken in any way in your alert and vigilant frame of mind. And though holiday rejoicing is necessary to the human spirit, yet it must add to the strength and resilience with which every man and woman turns again to the work they have to do, and also to the outlook and watch they have to keep on public affairs." Those words were broadcast by Sir Winston 20 years ago, and I submit that they are as true today as when they were spoken. He told us what we must do, and you, if I may say so, have set a shining example and given a powerful lead by founding this society in his name and in pursuit of the great ideals and principles for which he strove and fought. And may I wish you, Mr. Chairman, and all members of your society, good success in the future in all your undertakings. Mr. Chairman and members of the Winston Churchill Society, may I thank you again for the great honor you have done me and for the tremendous pleasure you have given me by inviting me to be with you on this unique and historic occasion, and by asking me to propose the toast to the memory of that very great man, soldier, author, artist, and statesman, the Right Honourable Sir Winston Spencer Churchill.